He sat there calm, quiet, the way only Denzel could, until De Niro said that line. A cheap shot, live on air, aimed at Denzel's legacy. The room laughed nervously, but Denzel didn't flinch. Then, with a voice colder than silence, he started a story. A story no one had heard. A betrayal buried in Hollywood history. And when he finished, even De Niro was speechless. What did Denzel say? That made Robert De Niro look like a rookie on live TV. The cameras were rolling, the lights were set, and the audience had no idea they were about to witness history. It was billed as the ultimate conversation. Hollywood legends sharing wisdom, memories, and laughter. On one side of the glossy round table sat Robert De Niro, relaxed, sharp-tongued, the self-proclaimed king of raw, unfiltered cinema. On the other side, Denzel Washington, calm and measured, his presence like a still ocean hiding deep currents. Everyone expected a classy, feel-good interview between the old guard of American acting. But 10 minutes in, something felt off. De Niro was on edge, unusually sarcastic, throwing out barbs disguised as jokes. The audience chuckled, thinking it was all in fun. But Denzel wasn't laughing. The conversation began light. Childhood stories, early auditions, favorite roles. De Niro told a crude joke about method acting that made even the host wince. Denzel nodded politely, letting it slide. Then came the subtle jabs, comments about playing it too safe, about always being the noble man, and about how some actors want to preach while others just act. Denzel's smile faded slightly. The audience noticed. The host nervously laughed and tried to shift the tone, but the damage was done. De Niro leaned back, smug, sipping from his water glass like he had just won a round. That's when it happened. Denzel tilted his head, slowly, studying De Niro like he was seeing him clearly for the first time. The air shifted. The audience's energy dropped. There was no outburst, no yelling, just a deep, growing silence that clung to the walls. De Niro raised an eyebrow, as if daring Denzel to respond. For a moment, it seemed like Denzel would let it pass. He adjusted his cuffs, glanced toward the audience, then locked eyes with De Niro. A barely noticeable smirk formed at the corner of his lips. The kind of smirk that warned of an incoming storm. No one in the room spoke. The crew held their breath behind the cameras. Denzel leaned forward just slightly, and in that moment, every person watching, from the control room to the audience at home, knew something unforgettable was about to happen. Because this wasn't just a clash of personalities. This was something deeper. Two men who had ruled very different kingdoms in Hollywood. One defined by explosive roles and unapologetic attitude. The other by quiet strength and moral weight. Their paths had run parallel for decades, always with respect, but never quite with warmth. De Niro had always been the rebel. Denzel had always been the rock. And now, the rebel had poked the rock too hard. The tremor was coming. The next words from Denzel's mouth would decide everything. But no one, not even De Niro, was ready for what came next. Denzel Washington didn't become a legend by chance. His rise came through a path forged with discipline, soul, and a relentless commitment to meaning. From his early days on the New York stage to his gripping film roles, Denzel always chose characters who stood for something. A wronged father. A struggling soldier. A man battling inner demons while still clinging to moral clarity. His performances were like sermons, raw, human, and unforgettable. And they weren't just for awards. They were statements. Messages. Warnings. He once turned down roles that would have made him richer but dimmed his voice. Because to Denzel, his legacy was never about money or fame. It was about truth. Meanwhile, on a parallel track, Robert De Niro built a career on going deep into the shadows. From the unhinged Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver to the brutal mobster in Goodfellas, De Niro lived for the extremes. He dove into roles that others ran from. He swore, raged, broke every rule, and audiences loved him for it. His genius was undeniable, but so was his chaos. To many, he was fearless. To some, he was reckless. And in those early years, Denzel watched him from afar with a complicated mix of respect and caution. Hollywood loved to pit them against each other, even if they rarely met. Journalists would ask Denzel if he admired De Niro's daring. They'd ask De Niro if he envied Denzel's elegance. The answers were always polite, but behind the curtain, something else brewed. Years ago, when Denzel was still on the climb, he was considered for a gritty political drama produced by a major studio. It was going to be his breakout into darker territory. But the part slipped away quietly. Rumors swirled that De Niro had made a call. That he didn't want Denzel crossing over into his lane. No one confirmed it. Denzel never spoke of it. But something changed after that. He stopped auditioning for certain types of roles. He carved his own lane. A lane no one could block. But that moment, that quiet betrayal, never fully left him. And it wasn't just about roles. It was about philosophy. De Niro represented the side of Hollywood that said art has no rules, anything goes, no matter who you offend. Denzel believed the opposite. That art must mean something. That some lines shouldn't be crossed, especially when they came at the cost of dignity. De Niro mocked politicians and power openly. Denzel spoke in churches and at universities. Their paths, while both successful, told two different stories about what being a man in Hollywood meant. And over time, their subtle jabs began to show. In one interview, De Niro shrugged off questions about social responsibility in film, saying, "That's not my job." A year later, Denzel gave a speech saying, "If you have a platform, you have a duty." It was never direct. But it was always personal. When they finally appeared together at that round table, the room held years of tension no one had addressed. The host tried to treat them as equals with no history. But history was there. In every pause. Every glance. De Niro cracked jokes with his usual edge, expecting everyone to laugh. And they did. Except Denzel. Because this wasn't just another interview to him. This was a quiet reckoning. A long overdue conversation. For Denzel, it was about drawing the line between cheap fame and lasting legacy. And for De Niro, it was about holding his ground as the old king of raw, unapologetic truth. But on that stage, the crown wasn't enough. Not anymore. Because Denzel had brought something De Niro didn't expect. A memory. A story. And a truth too sharp to ignore. The host had just wrapped up a light segment about their first auditions when the conversation shifted toward legacy. It was a question meant to flatter. What do you think you'll be remembered for? De Niro chuckled first, brushing the question off with a shrug and his trademark smirk. Hopefully not for being polite, he said, shooting a sideways glance across the table. The audience laughed, as they always did with him. Then came the follow-up. You've both played some of the most iconic roles in film history. Do you ever wish you'd taken different kinds of risks? De Niro didn't miss a beat. He turned toward Denzel, still smiling, but now his voice took on a sharper tone. Well, some of us take risks, he said, and some of us stay in that noble preacher mode. You know, always the good guy, the role model, the speechmaker. It's cute, it sells, but it's safe. The laughter this time was slower. Uneasy. The host smiled nervously and glanced at Denzel, who hadn't moved. Denzel didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He just stared at De Niro, his expression unchanged. The audience's laughter trailed off like a fading echo, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. De Niro leaned back in his chair, satisfied, like a man who thought he'd just made a clever joke and expected everyone to move on. But something about the silence didn't sit right. The host tried to recover. Well, there's room for all kinds of roles in Hollywood, right? Balance is what makes it great. Denzel still didn't speak. His hands were clasped in front of him, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were locked in, steady. That silence, so heavy and unbroken, felt louder than any shout could have been. The host glanced at a producer offstage. The audience shifted in their seats. De Niro cleared his throat and reached for his water, maybe realizing too late that his words had landed wrong. Because what he'd said wasn't just teasing, it was dismissive. It was a swipe at a career that had been built with intention, with dignity. A career that had stayed clean in an industry that thrived on mess. The jab wasn't random. It had history behind it. Years of quiet tension, masked in formal smiles and polite interviews. It was the kind of comment people in Hollywood made in private, behind closed doors. But De Niro had chosen to say it live, in front of a crowd, with cameras capturing every second. He may have thought it was a power move, a way to remind everyone of who he was, Robert De Niro, the untouchable icon. But in doing so, he'd underestimated something. He'd mistaken Denzel's calm for passiveness. He thought because Denzel didn't swing first, he wouldn't swing at all. That was the mistake. Because Denzel had built a career on patience, on knowing when to speak and when to let others bury themselves. And now, in front of the entire world, De Niro had handed him a loaded moment on a silver platter. What made the jab so cutting wasn't just the words, it was the way they were delivered. De Niro wasn't smiling with warmth. He was smirking with challenge. As if daring Denzel to respond. As if saying, "You won't say anything, because you never do." And maybe that would have been true years ago. Maybe the younger Denzel, the one still building his place, might have let it slide. But not today. Not after everything he'd seen and survived in this industry. Not after carving out respect in a town that gave it to others too easily and made him earn every inch. Denzel took a breath. The host asked the next question, trying to shift the conversation back to neutral ground. But the room was no longer neutral. Something had changed. You could feel it in the tension behind the host's smile. In the way the audience leaned in slightly, sensing a turn. In the way De Niro's fingers tapped the edge of his glass, faster now, nervous. Denzel finally moved. Just a small gesture, he shifted in his chair and leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes still on De Niro. Then he did something that caught everyone off guard. He smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Not one of amusement. One of preparation. And in that moment, everyone in the room felt it. Something was coming. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be angry. But it would be sharp, unforgettable, and it would be true. The kind of truth that makes people sit up and hold their breath. The kind of truth that doesn't shout, but silences. Denzel didn't have to rush. He knew he had the room now. And most importantly, he had the moment. A moment handed to him by a rival who thought he was untouchable. But in Hollywood, no one is untouchable forever. Especially not when the cameras are rolling, and the wrong words hang heavy in the air. The moment after De Niro's jab felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into a drop you didn't expect to find. Everyone on set knew something had shifted, but no one dared to name it. The host nervously flipped through his cue cards, grasping for a neutral topic to ease the tension. Someone in the audience coughed. A camera operator adjusted their focus. Denzel didn't say a word. Not yet. But it was the silence itself that became its own kind of answer. It wasn't the silence of someone who had been caught off guard, it was the silence of someone choosing the perfect moment to strike. His body language didn't change much, just a small lean forward, fingers interlocked in front of him, eyes still fixed on De Niro with the patience of a man who'd waited years for a moment like this. There was no panic. No need to rush. Because Denzel knew what De Niro didn't, this wasn't just a talk show. It was a stage, and the lights were all his now. The host awkwardly transitioned into the next question, trying to pull the focus back to something safe. Tell us about a time a role really changed your life. De Niro jumped in first, rattling off a well-rehearsed story about meeting Scorsese and improvising a scene that turned into a classic. He laughed at his own punchlines, looking around the room for reactions that didn't fully come. The audience clapped lightly, but their eyes kept drifting to Denzel. When it was Denzel's turn, he didn't jump in right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch again. Not uncomfortably, but intentionally. Then he spoke, slow, soft, but with weight in every word. I remember once, being asked to play a role that didn't sit right with me, he said. It paid well. It was a big studio job. But it asked me to be less than I am. Less than who my father raised me to be. The room fell into total stillness. He wasn't naming names. He didn't have to. The words cut deeper because they were calm, honest, and wrapped in dignity. And the subtext was deafening. He kept speaking, telling the story of turning down that role, walking away from a paycheck most actors would dream of. They told me I'd never work again if I passed. That people in this town wouldn't forget it, he continued. But I had to ask myself, what's the point of being seen if you have to disappear to be seen? That line hung in the air like a warning. You could see heads turning in the audience, eyes widening. Even the host stopped shuffling his cards. Everyone knew what Denzel was doing. He was answering De Niro without ever calling him out by name. He wasn't defending himself. He was redefining the argument. Showing that integrity wasn't safe, it was the real risk. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether Denzel had played it safe. It was whether De Niro had ever stood for something bigger than the role. The tension thickened. The room, once buzzing with celebrity energy, now felt like a courtroom waiting for a final verdict. De Niro sat back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, trying to look relaxed. But the stiffness in his jaw gave him away. He glanced at the host, then back at Denzel, who was still speaking, now about legacy. "I don't need people to clap for me when I'm done," he said. "I want them to think." It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it was sharp enough to cut glass. The kind of line that stops time. The kind that makes you look inward. De Niro looked down briefly, as if adjusting his watch, though it was clear he wasn't checking the time. He was checking himself. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. De Niro had come to the show expecting laughs, nostalgia, control. But now, he was sitting across from a man who had turned a passive-aggressive insult into a conversation about purpose, pride, and principle. And the audience knew it too. You could feel the shift. Denzel had taken the power of the room without ever raising his voice. The host tried again to move the discussion forward. "Let's lighten it up a bit," he said, chuckling, but it felt forced. Forced because the audience didn't want to move on. They were witnessing something real. Something rare. Denzel's voice had drawn them into a deeper place. They weren't watching a Hollywood roundtable anymore. They were watching a reckoning unfold. One built not on confrontation, but on character. And just when it seemed like Denzel had made his point, he paused, then added one final note. "People remember how you made them feel. But first, you have to decide who you're willing to be." That was it. No punchline. No mic drop. Just a truth so clear and simple it didn't need decoration. The audience burst into applause. Real applause. Not for show. Not for celebrity. But for truth. De Niro clapped too, but his hands moved slower. Less certain. And in that moment, it was clear, Denzel had already won the room. He hadn't roasted De Niro. He'd revealed him. There was a stillness in the studio that felt unnatural, like the calm before a sudden storm. Denzel sat upright now, both feet planted, no longer just reacting but fully in control. The host asked another question, clearly trying to regain balance, but it was useless. The room wasn't listening to the host anymore. They were watching Denzel. Even De Niro had gone quiet, the smug energy he arrived with slowly fading as his eyes shifted, trying to predict what might come next. He could sense it. Everyone could. Denzel wasn't finished. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't said anything directly confrontational. But what he was about to say next would land harder than anything loud ever could. With the timing of a master, Denzel turned to the host and said, "Can I share something I've never said on air?" The audience leaned in. The host nodded quickly, relieved to let Denzel steer. Denzel's voice stayed calm, but there was a new edge in it. "Years ago," he began, "I was considered for a film that would have changed my career. It was gritty, real. A side of me that most audiences hadn't seen yet. I was excited. Ready. I had a great meeting with the director. He told me I was perfect for the part." He paused, letting the words settle. But then, the phone stopped ringing. "I never got the second call. Never heard back. I didn't understand why, until someone told me privately that the role was taken back after a conversation with another actor. An actor who didn't think I belonged in that space." The room dropped into a hush. There were no names, but the implication was as loud as thunder. Eyes darted toward De Niro, who now shifted in his chair. He tried to look neutral, but his expression faltered. "I never confirmed it. I didn't need to," Denzel continued. "Because what stayed with me wasn't the rejection. It was the silence that followed. The silence from people who called themselves allies. People who clapped at award shows and nodded at speeches but stayed quiet when the rooms were being arranged behind closed doors. The audience murmured, stunned. Denzel wasn't accusing, he was revealing. He hadn't come to play games or settle old grudges. He'd come to speak what everyone else avoided. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't name names. But he made his point with the precision of a scalpel. The studio, now completely still, felt like a confession booth. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Then Denzel looked directly at De Niro, and for the first time all night, he broke the fourth wall between them. "I admired you," he said plainly. "Still do, in some ways. But sometimes the loudest silence in a room comes from someone who should have spoken up. And when people ask what bravery looks like in this business, it's not cursing on set or screaming at a camera. It's standing up when no one else will, even when it costs you something." The audience gasped. It wasn't just a story now. It was a confrontation. But done in Denzel's way. Calm. Clear. With truth, not ego. De Niro didn't interrupt. He didn't clap. His lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, he looked like he didn't know what to say. The host looked stunned. The crew behind the cameras froze, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. But no one dared to break the moment. Then Denzel leaned back, letting the silence stretch once again. And just when it seemed like it might be over, he added, "I don't say this to start a fight. I say it because young actors are watching. They think this business is just lights and applause. But the real moments, the ones that shape you, happen in silence. Behind the curtain. And people like us, with this kind of platform, we don't just owe them a performance. We owe them the truth." That was it. The audience, frozen for what felt like forever, suddenly erupted. Not in polite applause, but in something deeper. A standing ovation. Raw. Honest. Unrehearsed. The host wiped his face, unsure if he was sweating or tearing up. And De Niro. He clapped too. Slowly. But there was no hiding it. He had been humbled. Not humiliated. Not attacked. Just unmasked. Denzel hadn't destroyed him. He had exposed something bigger than one man. He had exposed the industry's quiet complicity, the unspoken deals, the way power worked in shadows. And that was the comeback. Not a roast. Not a joke. A truth so carefully delivered it couldn't be laughed off, denied, or forgotten. It wasn't savage because it was cruel. It was savage because it was undeniable. A moment that turned a casual jab into a spotlight and made everyone in the room and watching around the world reconsider what they thought they knew about Hollywood, power, and the men who sit at the top. The applause didn't fade like normal clapping. It stopped suddenly, as if people realized mid-motion that they were applauding something more than a performance. It was respect. It was shock. It was a moment that left them feeling like they had just watched something shift, not in entertainment, but in the balance of truth and power. Denzel sat still, his face calm, his presence steady, almost as if he hadn't just flipped a decades-old narrative on its head. The cameras continued to roll, but the air had changed. There was no more laughter. No more jokes. No more playful teasing between Hollywood elites. Just silence. A deep, electric stillness that said, without a doubt, that something permanent had just happened. The host didn't know what to do. His hands hovered over his cue cards as if hoping the next segment might lift the weight off the room. But how do you return to promo questions and light-hearted banter after watching someone carve open a wound this big with such care? De Niro remained seated, still facing forward, but something had left his eyes. The sharpness. The spark. The sense of command. Gone. He didn't fumble. He didn't fight back. But he looked older in that moment. Smaller. Not because Denzel had insulted him. Denzel hadn't. But because Denzel had spoken a truth De Niro could no longer outrun. It wasn't about one role lost or one comment made. It was about the pattern, the system, the quiet decisions made in backrooms and side conversations. It was about the moments people like De Niro could choose to speak up but didn't. And now that it had been said out loud, there was no putting it back in the box. De Niro shifted in his seat. His usual posture of confidence was replaced by something more guarded. He rubbed the side of his face, glanced at the audience, then at the floor. The man who had dominated so many screens with his presence now looked like he was hoping to disappear behind one. The host cleared his throat and tried to close the segment. "Well," he said with a forced smile, "that was powerful. Let's thank both of our guests for being here." The words felt small. The claps that followed were uneven, like people weren't sure if the show was truly over. The credits started to roll, but no one moved. Even the audience remained seated, as if waiting for some kind of cue that didn't come. Denzel finally stood, buttoned his jacket, and extended his hand toward the host. They shook, and the host gave a nod full of more gratitude than words. De Niro stood too, a beat behind, and offered his hand to Denzel. For a second, it looked like Denzel might walk past him. But he didn't. He took the hand, gave a single shake, and looked De Niro in the eye. No smile. No scowl. Just clarity. A look that said, "We both know what just happened here." The clip aired that night, and within hours, it went viral. Not because it was loud or flashy, but because it was rare. Raw. Real. It spread like wildfire across platforms, captioned with phrases like "Denzel drops truth bomb" and "De Niro silenced on live TV." But beyond the clickbait, something deeper happened. The clip was watched in film schools, passed around in group chats, studied in quiet corners of Hollywood. People in the industry began whispering about it. Not in gossip, but in reflection. Agents, directors, and actors who had sat in those quiet meetings Denzel described now had a name for what they'd witnessed. And fans, especially younger ones, saw something new. Not just two actors clashing, but two legacies colliding. One built on noise, the other on purpose. Over the next week, headlines popped up in every major outlet. Think pieces about power dynamics, about how the industry treats dignity versus drama. Reporters reached out for follow-up comments. Denzel stayed silent. He didn't need to say more. De Niro released a short statement days later, calling Denzel a force of integrity, but it read like someone trying to patch a wall that had already cracked. Publicly, the two men kept their distance. Privately, no one knew if they ever spoke again. But one thing was certain, everyone remembered the moment. That room. That silence. That line. The way De Niro's legacy suddenly felt heavier, and Denzel's felt even sharper. What was left unsaid became just as loud as what had been said. Because Denzel hadn't exposed De Niro to hurt him. He hadn't come to win. He came to speak. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that silence has power, but so does breaking it. In an industry that often rewards volume and chaos, Denzel's quiet storm shook the room. It reminded people that true respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And sometimes, earning it means standing alone, telling the truth while others sit in silence, hoping you won't.